Seconds after taking off from San Francisco, a United Airlines Boeing 747 shudders violently as one of its engines starts to fail. The intense vibrations terrify the passengers and are so strong that the pilots have trouble reading their instruments. Within moments, the aircraft is losing speed and altitude. The pilots struggle desperately with the controls as the aircraft veers off course and heads straight for a mountain. Petrified residents below the flight path telephone the airport fearing the worst, that a plane is about to crash into their neighbourhood. Will the pilots be able to rescue their stricken aircraft before time runs out? Over 300 lives hang in the balance. This is the story of United Airlines Flight 863. On the night of June 28, 1998, 288 passengers and 19 crew boarded United Airlines Flight 863 at San Francisco International Airport. They were bound for Sydney, Australia, a 15-hour journey. As this was an overnight flight, most of the passengers were settling in and hoping to get some sleep. This being 1998, there were no smartphones, so unfortunately, none of the passengers had access to this week's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Endel. Endel is an app on your phone that lets you pick between a variety of relaxing sounds which can help you fall asleep or even just relax during the day. What I like about Endel is that it adapts to your environment, so things like your location, the weather, and even your heart rate are all fed into the app to make sure that the sounds you're hearing at any given moment are tailored to you. This means that there's no repetition in these sounds, they're always changing to match your environment. You can even interact with them by tapping or dragging on these cool visuals on screen. There are a few different modes you can use depending on whether you'd like to sleep or focus during the day or just relax. Recently I've enjoyed using the wind down mode, which I found really useful in the evening before I go to bed, as it kind of takes my mind off whatever's been stressing me out during the day. I've also found the focus mode pretty useful, as I can just put my earphones on and use it to block out distractions while I get some work done. The first 100 people to download Endel at this link will get a free week of audio experiences, so click on that link in the description to be in that first 100 and enjoy some relaxing respite from these more serious videos. The aircraft being used for this flight was the Boeing 747-400. United Airlines was the largest operator of this aircraft in the United States, with 44 of the type in service. It formed the backbone of their long-haul fleet. In the cockpit on this night were 4 pilots, a captain, a first officer, and, sitting behind them, 2 relief pilots. The relief pilots would take over during the cruise over the Pacific Ocean. The captain was one of the most experienced pilots at United Airlines, having amassed over 23,000 hours of flying time. However, he was relatively new to the 747-400, with just 900 hours on this aircraft. The first officer was also an experienced pilot, with almost 10,000 hours of flying time. He had more time on the 747 than the captain, with 2,500 hours on this aircraft. At just after 10:30 that night, the massive aircraft pushed back from the gate at San Francisco. The passengers settled in for the long journey, oblivious not only to the fact that they would not make it to Sydney that night, but that within mere minutes, their very lives would be in grave danger. In a few short minutes, the pilots would find themselves in an emergency, one they had trained for many times, but one which, on this day, would call into question the quality of that training. This incident would lead to industry-wide changes in pilot training, and its implications would reach far further than just emergency situations. The pilots readied the aircraft for takeoff as they taxied out to runway 28 right at San Francisco. The plane was heavy, with nearly a full load of passengers, and its tanks filled with over 170 tons of fuel for the long journey across the Pacific. This would be right at the limit of what the 747 was capable of. At just after 10:30, the first officer steered the jumbo jet onto the runway and applied takeoff power. The aircraft thundered down the runway, and when it reached takeoff speed, the first officer pulled it into the air. Within seconds, the aircraft shook with loud thumping noises. There were intense vibrations, so much so that the pilots could barely read their instruments. The first officer initially thought that a tyre must have failed, but the captain noticed that the exhaust gas temperature for engine number 3, the inboard engine on the right-hand side, had exceeded normal limits. It had risen to 750 degrees Celsius, which was dangerously hot. The captain quickly brought the throttle lever for engine 3 back to idle. Within seconds, the temperature returned to normal and the vibration stopped. But now the pilots had a new problem. They were about as heavy as they could be, and now only had 3/4 of their normal engine power. On top of this, with less thrust coming out of the right-hand side of the aircraft than the left, the plane had started to turn to the right. It was now in a collision course with the San Bruno mountain, a 1,300-foot high hill to the northwest of the airport. But the pilots were as yet unaware of this. The captain was busy shutting down the engine and responding to all the warnings which had been thrown up. He asked the 2 relief pilots to carry out the engine shutdown checklist while the first officer flew the aircraft. The first officer found the aircraft sluggish and slow to respond to his inputs on the controls. He had started holding the control column to the left, trying to correct the right-hand turn the plane had now entered. But this action was completely against the training he had received on dealing with an engine failure. By using the control column to correct the slide to the right, the first officer was sticking the ailerons and spoilers up on the left wing. These created significant drag, slowing the plane down. The correct response to the turn would have been to use the rudder to get the plane to fly in a straight line, as this doesn't create nearly as much drag on the aircraft. While the first officer had arrested the turn to the right, the aircraft was now getting dangerously slow. It was precariously close to stalling. If it stalled at this altitude, there would be no space to recover it. It would simply fall out of the sky and crash into the densely populated residential area below, causing untold loss of life. Suddenly, the relief pilots noticed that the plane's airspeed had dropped significantly. Both shouted "Airspeed" simultaneously, alerting the first officer to his low speed, which had decreased by 40 knots. The stick shaker then activated, vibrating both pilots' control columns violently. This warned the crew that the aircraft was about to stall. The captain's attention snapped back to flying the aircraft. He took over from the first officer and lowered the nose of the aircraft to prevent a stall. But then, another terrifying alarm sounded. The ground proximity warning alarm.
Terrain.
This alerted the pilots that they were getting close to a collision with the mountain ahead of them. It urged them to pull up, but as they were close to stalling, they couldn't do this. In fact, the captain had no choice but to hold the nose of the plane down so that it could regain speed. Every second, the plane drew closer to the mountain. The captain watched in horror as the radio altimeter drew ever closer to 0. Back at the airport, the controller watched helplessly as Flight 863 veered off course while descending and then disappeared from radar. Distressed residents of the area over which the aircraft was flying began to telephone the airport. The extreme noise of the low-flying aircraft was nearly deafening, and they were terrified that the plane was about to crash. The aircraft gradually began to gain speed as the captain held it on the knife edge between a stall and a climb. Seconds later, the aircraft passed over the San Bruno mountain, missing it by only about 30 meters. To put this in perspective, that's less than half the wingspan of the 747. The captain then gradually climbed as the plane's speed increased, and the crew declared an emergency to air traffic control. They wanted to return to San Francisco, but there was a problem. They were way too heavy to land. If they touched down at their current weight, the aircraft could break apart on the runway. They would need to dump a significant amount of fuel in order to land. San Francisco Air Traffic Control gave the crew instructions to fly out over the Pacific Ocean and to climb to an altitude of 5,000 feet. As they climbed, they finally broke out of the clouds and found themselves in a clear night sky. They retracted the flaps and began circling out over the Pacific as they reached 5,000 feet. From here, the crew began dumping fuel. "30 minutes had passed since the pilots had begun dumping fuel. In this time, they had managed to dump about 60 tons. However, they were still too heavy to land. During this time, however, the conditions at San Francisco had gotten foggier. In fact, the visibility was getting worse by the minute. If the crew continued to dump fuel, they risked being unable to land at San Francisco and needing to divert. But if they decided to return to San Francisco now, they would be landing overweight and risking damage to their aircraft. Nonetheless, after a discussion in the cockpit, the crew decided that it would be better to land back at San Francisco, even though they were still overweight. At around 11:30 that night, the crew touched down on runway 28 right at San Francisco. All 307 passengers and crew had survived the ordeal. The passengers had no idea quite how close they had come to disaster. For them, this return to San Francisco was just a disappointing end to what was supposed to be a journey to Sydney. They would only find out in the newspapers over the following days that they had nearly collided with the San Bruno mountain. The loss of an engine after takeoff is a serious event, but it shouldn't be life-threatening. Why had this flight come so close to disaster? Was this inevitable, given the unfortunate placement of the San Bruno mountain to the north of the airport? As it turns out, there was no need for this flight to have come so close to disaster. After the incident, the 4 pilots were interviewed. The first officer reported that when the engine failed, he had responded to the loss of thrust by pulling back on his control column. This was an instinctive response aimed at keeping the aircraft in a climb, but it was not what he had been trained to do. Keeping the airspeed above stall speed is always the priority in an aircraft. By pulling back on his control column, the first officer allowed the aircraft's speed to drop. Further, he compounded this airspeed problem by using the ailerons to counteract the asymmetric thrust after the engine loss, rather than the rudder. This further reduced the aircraft's speed. If it wasn't for the relief pilots noticing that the airspeed was getting dangerously low, the speed would have dropped even further, and the outcome of this flight may not have been so lucky. But why had the first officer made such basic mistakes? Maintaining airspeed at all costs and using the rudder to trim the aircraft in an asymmetric thrust condition were procedures he had learned at the beginning of his flying career, and they were procedures which he would have practiced in the simulator many times since being licensed to fly the 747. As it turns out, you could be deceived by measuring the first officer's experience on the 747 by just looking at the hours he had spent flying it. Despite his 2,500 hours of experience in this aircraft, he had only performed 1 takeoff and 1 landing in the year leading up to this incident. As such, he was woefully out of practice in flying the aircraft manually. This meant that when the engine failed after takeoff, he was simply incapable of using basic manual flying skills to keep the aircraft within safe parameters. But the first officer was not the only member of the flight crew who wasn't performing at his peak on this night. While no doubt the one who saved the aircraft, the captain acknowledged afterwards that his decision to focus exclusively on troubleshooting the failing engine, rather than to monitor the first officer's operation of the aircraft, contributed to the plane's close call with the mountain. Ultimately, the fault which led to this near catastrophe cannot be located in the pilots alone. The fact that the first officer had only performed a single takeoff and landing in the year leading up to this incident was not his fault, but the airline's. How had United Airlines arranged their schedule so that a pilot responsible for hundreds of lives could be so out of practice at a moment as critical as an engine failure? In recognition of this failing, United filmed a recreation of the flight in one of their simulators in the weeks following the incident. They showed it to all 9,500 of their pilots, and stressed the importance of correctly using the rudder in response to an engine failure. They also revised their training protocols to ensure that flight crews are more rigorously trained to deal with engine failures, and a host of other emergencies. These more rigorous protocols have since become standard across the industry. Finally, United introduced new rules, which meant that pilots had to make at least 3 takeoffs and landings in a 90-day period. While these changes may have reduced the number of similar incidents in subsequent years, the degradation of manual flying skills among airline pilots across the industry remains a known safety issue, and has contributed to several fatal accidents, most recently including Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501 in 2014, which I've covered here on the channel. Flight 863 is still used for the San Francisco to Sydney route, although nowadays the flight is operated by Boeing 777 and 787. Special thanks to the Patreon and YouTube members for helping to make this video possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel by signing up with the links here on screen. I'd especially like to thank Snowdoggo and Joey for their very generous support. Green Dot Aviation now has a Discord server, so if you'd like to join a growing community of people discussing all things aviation, just tap on the link in the video description and I'll see you there. I hope you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.